NIST has given some advice. We have to realize that one of the reasons that NIST did this, the main reason that NIST does this, whenever there's a catastrophic disaster of some kind, NIST is empowered to study it and to make recommendations about future things to do. And right now they're advising against unsupported long strut building designs in the future. The recommendations have been taken up by the International Code Council and the National Fire Protection Association. So there's quite a bit of that. Again, I've been confused. I actually just found out from Richard that he thinks the thermates were used here, which are hot but not as explosive, and the thermites, or nanothermites rather, were used in the towers. So I keep finding new information like that. But one of the things that I wonder about with these findings, I know you completely disagree with the findings of how this building collapsed. Do you also oppose the building and fire and safety recommendations that NIST has released in these reports?
Well, we have 1 minute now for the two of you to discuss that. Perhaps Richard would like to start.
In fact, I do. There are billions of dollars that are spent needlessly as a result of the recommendations that NIST forced on, or that were forced in effect on several other building codes.
Well, that would scare me if you won that argument.
It's needless. And architects and engineers, 1,400 of us, are crying for a new investigation. We're crying out to understand how this collapse looks so much like an explosive demolition. Let's take a look. Let's take a look. Let's take a look. Let's take a different look.
That's my side. We need to go to Richard's side. We should give him a few seconds for this.
There we go.
That's still my side, everybody. I'm not going to enforce the 0 seconds on you, Richard. That wouldn't be fair.
You're a sweetheart, Chris. How come, Chris, they look so similar? Wouldn't you want a new investigation since they look, World Trade Center 7 and another known controlled demolition look almost exactly alike?
You know, you never play the sound on track on these, do you? Why not?
Well,
because they sound completely different.
Well, of course they do. One is high-energy explosives. One is thermite, which doesn't have the loud bang.
So these are different kinds of collapses in one way or another.
It's a deceptive controlled demolition. That's why we find pools of molten iron underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, gentlemen. We just got word in from Congress. They gave us an earmark to be able to extend that. And Richard did get some of his time back after all. All right, then. Now we are going to go to Chris Mohr with a question as follows. It's about the fires in World Trade Center 7, the number and the size and the duration. Mr. Mohr, the fires in Building 7 seem to be regular office fires without jet fuel. How could they have been big enough to bring down that building?
Well, that's a good question, obviously, and it was the one that NIST had to work on for a very, very long time, because it's true that the airplanes didn't come crashing in there. One of the things that I've been kind of struck by is that when I watch the videos of both Richard Gage and others, that have put out these various videos, Stephen Jones and others, that I usually see that New York Police Department north side thing, but there are many pictures of much, much more damage on this. The World Trade Center had its origin on 10 different floors of where it began the fires. The water supply to fight the fires in World Trade Center was impaired, and there were no efforts made to fight the fires. And when you see these pictures on the other side, they are really raging. Eyewitness Chris Mohr, a firefighter, said it was a huge hole right in the middle of it. Here we have responders walking through the nice, cool debris pile while Building 7 fire is raging on. You can see smoke pouring out of most of the floors here. And you can see also what happens with the debris and how it affects it. It's very, very serious. Let me hit this again. Here it is coming down. Of course, this is the tower now coming down. And it's sending a lot of debris over onto Building 7. We can also see more of that kind of thing happening in here. You can see how much the debris, much of that burning coming right on. You can see damage to the building. It wasn't structural damage, but there was a lot of damage that would be caused with the burning. We can also see other kinds of... Now, why is that happening? Oh, there we go. Okay. This is an ABC film shortly before the collapse that shows a tremendous amount of damage here. And we see over and over again, we see slides from the other side that show that problem of there being a lot more damage than is shown in your typical videos from the 9/11 Truth Movement. Here is just a few more to kind of keep us going here. These pictures and videos from the north face don't show much damage, but this is a whole different thing. Now, I know that Richard would say that these pictures show smoke but no fire, but I would say that where there's smoke, especially when it's on most of the floors like it is here, that now that fire has gone into the middle of the building, and that's very, very important to know because that's where the collapse actually started.
Richard, 2 minutes to respond.
Wouldn't we expect that if there were lots of fire damage and lots of debris damage on the south side of the building, that the building would have fallen toward its injured side? Does it do that? No. In fact, we have only small fires on the north side, and these are the largest fires we have evidence for, actually. And Appendix L of the draft report from NIST shows that these fires were out by 4:45 in the afternoon. Now, how can they have caused the initiation of collapse on the 12th floor around column 79 when they were out at least a half hour to 45 minutes prior to that collapse? NIST says this whole building came down due to the failure of a single column, this one here, because of the thermal expansion of these. Well, how can they expand thermally when they are fireproofed and protected from that expansion? When they have shear studs that are tied into the composite metal decking? Why did NIST falsify the records by applying the heat load in their computer models to these beams, all of them in just 1.5 seconds, forcing them inside the computer model to expand at an abnormal rate independently from the slab on top, the concrete slab, which they did not apply any heat to? This is falsification, fraudulent use of science. It should not be allowed. Look at the computer animation. 400 structural steel connections failing per second, like you're spraying water on a sandcastle. That's the rate of failure in what really is a redundant designed steel structure system that should not be failing like this. They won't even show us the rest of the collapse. It stops after a couple of seconds.
Thank you, Richard.
And it begins to tip over, unlike the videos showing a straight-down symmetrical collapse at free fall.
All right. Our next question.
I'm
sorry, I was so entranced by the video. We got our 1 minute back and forth for the both of you on this.
Well, first of all, I'm stunned at the suggestion that the fires were almost out right before the collapse. That completely blows my mind and goes against all those videos and pictures that I show. And briefly, as far as the fireproofing, NIST said that since the fireproofing was painted on as opposed to the steel or rather concrete reinforcement that is typical in large buildings, that's something they're kind of recommending against. They're also recommending against these long struts that are allowed to expand in a way that lesser struts don't tend to do. These are safety recommendations. I am very, very glad for those safety recommendations. I feel a lot safer because those recommendations have been made. I don't think it's a waste of money. My life isn't a waste of money.
Well, the fires were out on the 12th floor where the initiation of collapse was said to have begun by NIST. They acknowledge this in their draft report. Check it out. Also, regarding the damage, NIST suggests that the damage is insignificant, not a causative factor. Neither was diesel fuels, by the way. It was the normal office fires that brought the building down.
All right, thank you. Our next question goes to Richard Gage, and it concerns the characteristics of collapse, the near symmetrical destruction. Mr. Gage, you claim that Building 7 came straight down, and it indicates controlled demolition. Why couldn't this happen as a natural collapse?
Well, it can't happen because, as this NIST computer model shows, they can't even get their own computer model to behave the way a controlled demolition behaves. So they stop it after about 2 seconds. They won't even show us the collapse, nor will they release the input data. It can't happen because the perimeter wall unit, the perimeter wall structure of this building would deform as the internal collapse, which they allege is happening. It would have pulled in those perimeter wall units. It can't happen because the building falls straight down into its own footprint. A building would have fallen over due to natural causes in an organic collapse.
You still have some more time if you'd like to use it.
I yield my time.
Probably you won't get it back. All right, then. We now get 2 minutes of rebuttal from Chris Mohr.
Okay. as far as the whole symmetrical destruction question, and also I know one of the things that Richard loves to talk about is the path of most resistance. It keeps falling through the path of most resistance. That's what gravity does. It pushes things straight down towards the center of the Earth. In the Royal Gorge right here in Colorado, the stream that is only a few miles from relatively flat territory pushed its way through the path of most resistance with that flat terrain nearby because gravity kept pushing it down as the uplift happened. So the path of most resistance is not really all that's going on. The second thing is that it takes a lateral force to push things off to the side. You can't just have something that says, well, this would be the path of least resistance, so I'll go over here. You need a lateral force to push it over here. A real good example of a lateral force is an earthquake. Many pictures that I have here are good examples of earthquakes that have lateral force in them that push the buildings over to the side. That's why we expect it in that situation. Thomas Eagar said the building is 95% air. It can implode into itself. A large structure has too much inertia to fall down in any other direction except nearly straight down. Michael Brown pointed out that the collapses for all the buildings began where they were tilted towards that weakened collapse point. In this case, the weakened collapse point was the east penthouse, and it did tilt 6 degrees into that, but most of it was an internal collapse, and then finally the perimeter collapsed after that. The other thing that kind of blows my mind about this falling into its own footprint sort of thing, these are the sloppiest controlled demolitions in history. I don't know what is going on. Obviously, Tom Sullivan must not have been involved in these because these things have a 16-acre debris pile. There's stuff flying all over the place in every direction, and that is not characteristic of a successful controlled demolition. We can see it tilting a little bit to there. This particular one, there's interesting problems because at least on the north face, we don't see squibs, we don't see dust ejection. We see a building that's wider than it is high in some ways in one direction. And again, as I said, it didn't fall into its own footprint. It caused horrible damage to the Verizon building especially.
Gentlemen, 1 minute.
The building falls to the path of least resistance after that resistance is removed. As you'll see on the slide here, we have 80 columns. In order to bring a building straight down uniformly into its own footprint, all of those columns have to be removed virtually simultaneously. Otherwise, the building will begin to tip over, as it does in the example of every fire-induced collapse of a building.
But in the inside of the building, it's this mess of collapsing, and 79 is one of the very last columns to go, Richard. It's not, before that, there are other columns that are collapsing one after another. It's all happening with the outside perimeter somehow holding itself together until the very end. It was a very asymmetrical collapse in that the middle of it was a complete mess of one column after another until nothing was left to support it at all.
The main penthouse falls a second before the overall, indicating those core columns were cut virtually simultaneously.
And now we're going to go to our next question, and it is for Mr. Chris Mohr. Chris, again, speaking about the characteristics of the collapse and free fall acceleration, it is acknowledged by NIST that for a portion of the time the building fell at the free fall acceleration. This, by intuition, would lead one to think that there was a controlled demolition involved. What do you say for that?
I asked NIST this repeatedly, and I asked several people at NIST. I also sent them emails. The email I got back didn't really acknowledge that there was much of a problem there. So that was frustrating in terms of creating a narrative about how free fall collapse is possible in this situation. The bottom line of what NIST said really was building, gravity, collapse. You know, they basically said it doesn't matter if it's free fall or very nearly free fall for any of the buildings. And the reason they say that is because and then they much more politely said to me, there is so much overwhelming force that is bringing it down that free fall is not a problem. I talked to some other people to get a better sense of that, and we can see a little bit of that on this video here too. Let's watch this very, very carefully. This is where we see, first of all, the east penthouse beginning its collapse. And is that going? There it goes. It is going. Okay. It takes 7 or 8 seconds after the east penthouse collapse, and then there's this buckling that happens that is almost invisible over many floors.